Today I'm going to demonstrate how I install a tile backsplash, including the trick I use to cut out spaces for electrical outlets. It's a great informative episode, so stick around. Hey gang, Joe here, and I wanted to show you how I installed a little bit of tile to transform the look of this kitchen. So here we go. To start off, I turn off the power and remove electrical outlets from the wall. I then place the wires back into the electrical box. The exposed wires really should be capped with wire nuts at this step, just in case power is accidentally turned on. Then I remove the skin that happened to be on the wall. Fortunately, it peels off very easily and does not leave any major residue on the wall surface. I lightly sand with a medium to fine grit sandpaper and then wipe the wall to remove any dust created. Now I go ahead and run some painter's tape in an effort to keep the surrounding counter as clean as possible throughout this process. I'm using pre-assembled tile sheets and lay them out to get an idea of overall spacing. My plan was to cut the first sheet of tile just enough to create a square edge. I use a wet tile saw and decide to cut the tile in its packaging. I ended up cutting more off than planned to remove a broken tile. This will end up causing some spacing problems I will discuss in a bit later. Next, I pour and begin mixing the mortar, which will be used to adhere the tile to the wall. I follow the instructions, adding the correct amount of water and mix for the described duration. I let the mortar sit for a bit and then begin applying it to the wall. I apply a hearty amount, making sure to cover a space larger than the first tile sheet. I then trowel the mortar using a small V-notch tool in an attempt to leave the appropriate amount of mortar on the wall. After evenly troweled, I apply the first sheet of tiles. I set the square edge to the corner wall, leaving a small gap. I also use a couple of spacers along the bottom edge to provide a uniform space off the counter. I press the tile in place and try to remove any excess grout that oozes out of the joints. I then add more mortar and trowel it in order to place the next sheet of tile. I add the spacers on top of the countertop trim and I make sure to line up the tiles appropriately. I press the sheet into place firmly with a rubber float and again remove any excess mortar from the grout joints. I go over the first two sections with a press roller for extra measure. The next sheet of tile falls over an outlet that I will need to cut a hole for. To do this, I use the square cardboard that came with the tile. I place the tile sheet on the counter in line with the position it will sit on the wall. I then square the edge of the cardboard to the edge of the last tile on the bottom row. I make marks for the width of the outlet onto the cardboard. I transfer these marks to the backside of the tile sheet and create vertical lines across the sheet using a square. These lines represent the width of the opening. I determine the height of the box by temporarily placing the tile sheet up to the wall and counting how many tile rows there are until I reach the opening, both from the bottom and the top of the tile sheet. I make marks on the back of the tile sheet indicating these rows and use a razor to cut the sheet here. I end up with 3 rows of tiles and the middle section is where the outlet will be cut from. I cut along the vertical lines of the middle section and keep the outside sections. I then place mortar and trowel it on the wall space around the outlet and place the now 4 separate sections of tile to make up the entire sheet. Now I simply continue applying and troweling mortar and placing full tile sheets. I repeat this process and try to remove any mortar that oozes out of the grout joints along the way. When I get to the next outlet, I repeat the same template process as before and cut out the outlet space. Because the outlet space is near the edge of the tile, I have to cut off a few pieces of individual tiles that I will need to hold on to. I decide to apply enough mortar to cover the rest of the wall surface and trowel it to the appropriate thickness. I place the individual tile sheets around the outlet, pressing them into place and removing excess oozing mortar. I then place and press the final sheet of tile into place. As you can see, this leaves some open spaces around the outlet. This is where I use the small pieces of tile I cut off when making the outlet space. I simply press them into place one by one. The last full tile sheet fits the remaining space, but I'm left with a bunch of open spaces. To accommodate, I cut individual tiles to size and place them into each open space. Next, I cut strips of tile 2 rows deep to fill the remaining space below the cabinets. I make sure to line the pieces up and press into place. With the entire wall surface tiled, I then go over the tile with a moist sponge to remove any mortar. I then let everything sit overnight. The next day, I start with making some slight cuts around the electrical box with a tile bit and Dremel. One of the outlet mounting holes was covered by a piece of tile, so I removed just enough material to gain access to the mount. To be completely sure there is plenty of room in the grout joints, I make one more pass with a flathead screwdriver, scraping out any excess mortar. I then take a toothbrush to wipe out any powder created by the scraping. Now I am ready to mix up the grout compound. I follow the grout preparation directions, adding the appropriate amount of water and mixing for the recommended length of time. I then mist the entire wall and grout joints with water and wipe everything down with a moist sponge. I use a trowel to put some grout compound on a rubber float and then begin to apply grout to the tile surface. I make sure to push the grout in the joints. I then place the float at a 45-degree angle and scrape the grout in one direction. I repeat this process for the entire tiled surface, making sure grout fills every joint. Next, I take a wet sponge and begin to wipe down the tile surface. The goal here is to remove the excess grout off the tile without removing it from the grout joints. I have to rinse the sponge often and replace the rinse water frequently. I repeat this sponge process several times to remove the majority of the excess grout. I now allow everything to sit for a few hours. I remove the masking tape. During this period, the grout cures a bit and a haze forms on the tile surface. I then take a dry sponge to buff the haze off the tile surface. Now it was time to replace the receptacles, but I needed longer mounting screws to accommodate the extra depth created from the tile. I rewire the receptacles correctly. Of course, power is still off. Black wires to gold screws and white wires to silver screws, and the copper wire to the grounding screw. I place the outlet into the wall and secure with the longer mounting screws. Then I replace the outlet cover. For good measure, I decide to apply some sealant to help keep the grout surface clean. I lightly coat the tile surface with the spray and allow to dry for about 30 minutes. I then wipe the tile surface and then apply another coat. Again, after about 30 minutes later, I wipe down the tile surface. Lastly, I apply a bead of caulk to the joints between the tile and the wall and countertop edges. I purposely left grout out of these joints to allow for expansion and contraction. So there you have it. A little bit of effort installing a tile backsplash can make a huge difference to the look and feel of a room. If you found this helpful, please consider subscribing for other do-it-yourself type videos. Thanks for watching.